So before we get started, we just wanted to outline our 3 objectives for the session. So you'll see here on this next slide, participants will learn how one library began challenging conversations about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and turn those discussions into actions. And you might hear us saying the acronym EDI as we go on. So if you keep hearing that, that's what we're referring to. Participants will also engage in conversation strategies to encourage those difficult discussions on EDI. Participants will reflect on ways to apply strategies at their own institutions with colleagues and or patrons. So this will be interactive as to the best we can via Zoom as we go on here today. So before we continue, we just wanted to offer a land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that all Utah State University courses are taught on the traditional lands of the Dene, Goshute, Paiute, Shoshone, and Ute peoples past and present, and honor the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. So here's today's, our snapshot of today's plan. You'll see that we're going to give you some background information on how we really started these conversations at Utah State University libraries. We're going to go into more definitions about really what we're talking about when we're saying these definitions, like, or all of these different terms like equity, diversity, and inclusion, and kind of go into that. We're going to have some discussion activities, some best practices that we came up, especially geared towards teaching and creating lesson plans, but also I think they could be applied, in different office settings as well. Always some time for reflection and questions throughout. And we just wanted to also give the disclaimer that we're learning too. While we are here today offering tips and best practices on facilitating discussions on diversity and inclusion, we are by no means EDI experts, but rather fellow explorers on this path. So our first question that we have for all of you, and you could think about this for a minute, what does a respectful discussion look like to you? Just think about it for a few minutes, more like a few seconds, 30 seconds or so. And this could really mean, it could be for whatever setting that you imagine, whether it's in a classroom, in an office setting, in a public library, at a meeting. And so now Jessica is going to chat, or in chat, she's going to put in, you can just go to menti.com and then use the code 37546. So either on your computers or on your phone, if that's accessible to you, again, just go to menti.com, M-E-N-T-I, and use that code. And then we'll just, this is all anonymous. That's why we're doing it not in the chat here, but rather in Menti. And then I'll just start reading them as they come through. If anyone has questions, please just let us know in chat. So what components would that really look like to you? Okay, so really taking the time to listen to one another, listening, it's all coming in at the same time. Everyone acknowledging that we are all at different stages in our learning and growth. I love that. Equal give and take, kindness towards opposing views, empathy, perspective taking. These are excellent. I think our work here is done. I don't think we need to even go on. Sharing and listening, safe environment where people can share. I love these. Being brave enough to give your feedback or experience, but not trying to figure out what people want to hear. I love that. Talking about each other's experiences and asking questions. Yes, not being passive aggressive, maybe not having an agenda. Okay, and I'll just wait one more minute for another second here for a few others that are coming in, because these are all so good. Different opinions are respected, and also going in without assumptions. These are great. Okay, Jessica, thanks. So as you're interacting in today's session, I think just kind of keeping all of these principles and others in mind are just going to help us to all know what other participants need to participate and interact in these discussions. And of course, as many of you have already said, these are difficult discussions and conversations to have and require vulnerability. So in terms of strategies to consider, you know, as you're moving forward with trainings at your own library, here are strategies that we already put together in terms of considering. So like we did today, deciding on some ground rules, being mindful of when you should speak and when you should remain silent, respecting others by recognizing how often, much, and loud you're speaking, and whether or not you're dominating the conversation, just like a few of you had already mentioned. Sometimes it can also mean stepping up, especially if you don't talk a lot. Communicating to be understood, and really what I meant by that was kind of sometimes people speak to vent. This is that passive aggressive comment that I heard one of you say. Sometimes we're trying to sound more knowledgeable or grandstanding because it feels good in that moment. But really communicating to be understood means being as honest and open as possible. And again, like a few others said, speaking from your own point of view, not saying everything that you think all at once. And I think a big thing, like many of you had mentioned already, being open to hearing different perspectives that exist and a commitment to better understand the perspective of those whom you are speaking with. Rejecting all name calling, belittling, stereotyping, bias, kind of holding each other accountable for that. And of course, you know, a lot of this is more of like a meta moment. It's not just applying to today, but in the future, as you're doing your own trainings or teaching your own classes or whatever, wherever you think that you might be having, you know, conversations like these. These are all great strategies. And that last one, like someone said, being brave. And I think it takes bravery to be vulnerable and also great strength to be compassionate rather than judgmental. So a little bit of background info, because you might be thinking now, okay, so we're talking about EDI principles, but why, you know, what made these 4 librarians at Utah State University, you know, really tackle this topic, and why are they here today presenting at this fall workshop? So a little context, we're at the state land grant in Logan, Utah, northern Utah, practically in Idaho. Our primary goal of our department at USU Libraries is that we teach information literacy skills to university students. And so every year we decide on various unit goals. And so last year, the 4 of us were on a unit goal together that was this here that you see, exploring EDI needs of students to identify opportunities and improvements in shared LES instruction. LES is what we call our Learning and Engagement Services unit. We're essentially all reference and instruction librarians. And so the other part was exploring next steps for expansion into other areas of our work, like at the information desk, with our student workers in terms of training, and even on our library website. So we just wanted to kind of start by giving you kind of this high level picture, and then we'll drill down into actually what we did in terms of trainings and the documentation that we came up with. So in terms of some of the major accomplishments and contributions that we've done, that we've contributed over this past year as we've worked on this goal, I think one of the things that I'm at least most proud of is that we've actually started having pretty regular discussions on these topics within our unit meetings. We meet sometimes every week. Typically these conversations might come in once a month. We've offered several trainings in our unit throughout the year, a modified form of this one that we're giving you today, in fact, and also one on microaggressions in the classroom. And there was a training on that. We also developed best practices for both creating and also teaching a lesson using equity, diversity, and inclusion principles, which Katie's going to talk to you more about in a little bit. And we are working library-wide to integrate more of these conversations and practices into established library and unit structures. For instance, we now have a library-wide EDI task force that Dory is part of. So that gives you kind of a brief background on what we've been doing at USU on diversity and inclusion conversations. Now Jessica is going to launch into a discussion on definitions, followed by some activities.
Thanks, Erin. So hi, everyone. We're now going to talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion and what they are, as well as why we started looking into EDI. So to discuss what equity, diversity, inclusion are, I'm going to ask you 2 questions and you can respond to them in the chat. You'll have about 2 minutes to respond to each question, and then I'll read out some of the responses. So the first question is, what do equity, diversity, and inclusion mean to you? So go ahead and type your responses into the chat. Okay, we have connecting actions with our values and care, fairness and respect for others. Great. Compassion for all, understanding the value of others. Lifting up marginalized voices, people, populations, communities, making sure that everyone feels welcome and has the resources they need to succeed, not just the acceptance, but the celebration of all. These are great responses. Equity is helping people and starting where they are, not where we are. Equal access means everyone gets equal access and opportunities. Diversity means different backgrounds, cultures, ages, genders, sexual orientation, ethnicities, languages, races. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. These are all really good examples of what equity, diversity, and inclusion are. Now I'm going to ask you another question. And this question is, how are EDI topics showing up in your everyday work? So go ahead, you can respond to that in the chat as well. Appreciating hiring practices. Yep. Collection development. Had a research consultation this morning on environmental justice. Awesome. So definitely in conversations with students. Student research topics. Deciding which communities new libraries are being built. They have a committee that's working toward more awareness and training opportunities, collection development, promoting resources. Great. These are all awesome examples. And you can go ahead and keep posting those in the chat. And I'm going to move forward, and I'm going to share a few things that we looked at as a group to help us understand what equity, diversity, and inclusion are. And this first graphic, it's been adapted from the Utah Division of Multicultural Affairs, and it explains what equity, diversity, and inclusion are. So equity, diversity, and inclusion involves understanding that we're different, learning to communicate and acknowledge differences in a welcome environment, and understanding that there are systemic barriers that have prevented the full participation of some groups. So equity, diversity, and inclusion involve all of these things. So to help us understand equity even further, because sometimes it can be hard to understand the difference between equity and equality, I'm going to show you another graphic of 3 people trying to view a baseball game over a fence. So in this first image, it's assumed that everyone will benefit from the same support, such as giving everyone the same sized box to see over the fence. So they are being treated equally. In the second image, individuals are given different supports to make it possible for them to have equal access to the game. So in this case, the person who can see over the fence isn't given a box, or they don't have a support, while the person who can't see over the fence on their own is given a support appropriate to their circumstances. So they are being treated equitably. In the third image, all 3 of the individuals can see the game through a chain link fence without any supports or accommodations because the cause of the inequity was addressed. So the systemic barrier has been removed. So these definitions helped us understand the difference between equality, equity, and systemic barriers. But we also wanted to look at why diversity is important for us. And to help us understand that, we actually looked at statistics for Utah State that are provided by USU's Office of Analysis, Assessment, and Accreditation to help us understand why diversity is important. And these data show us that the USU's minority population makes up about 19.8% of USU's total enrollment. And what this means is that about 1 in 5 of the students we interact with at Utah State will be part of a minority population, which is a lot. It's also important to note that these are only racial data, and it doesn't include any information about age, gender identity, ability status, or other types of identities. So after seeing these data, we wanted to look at how we could support all of our patrons. And we knew it would take effort, but the effort was worth it for us because there's so many benefits of diversity. And this next slide goes over a few of those benefits. So diversity encourages a variety of perspectives and skills. It increases creativity, more thorough problem solving occurs, and you get better connections with those you serve. So these are all reasons why we wanted to pursue EDI work. And we decided to start by having conversations about equity, diversity, and inclusion within our own unit. Now, Dory is going to share with us some of the activities we used in our unit to encourage EDI conversations.
Thank you, Jessica. So as was mentioned, our goal with this work was initially focused on considering EDI needs connected to teaching practices. But what we found is that we spent more time first on building community and understanding amongst ourselves before diving right into that teaching context. And what I have here on the screen, I wanted to first share 3 things that we considered. So when selecting the activities that I'm going to share, we considered how those in our unit have responded to learning in the past and the types of learning experience that our unit values overall. So with that in mind, we catered our selection to those that included active learning and reflection. Also for group size, we had 10 to 14 people attend our various activities and discussions throughout the past year. So we tailored our activities to this smaller size. Those who attended have also been at the library anywhere between 1 to 15 or more years. And so we tried to keep this in mind in terms of recognizing the range of experience with the library that was present in those discussions. In terms of community comfort level, our unit is very collaborative, and so that collaborative nature gave us a good foundation from which to build upon in these conversations. I do think that if you're working with a newer group of folks, or if collaboration isn't as apparent, then there might need to be some additional preliminary conversations. So as I review some of these activities, again, they were tailored to our unit, and so I would invite you to think about your own work environment and the dynamics that you engage in every day, and think about how you might modify some of these to fit your own needs. So the very first thing we did was exactly what Jessica modeled for us, which was we figured out, we had discussions to unpack what EDI means to us in our unit. And then next we facilitated an activity that focused on learning what has shaped us as people. And we asked our coworkers to think about the 3 most defining moments in their life, to write them down, and then to present at least one of those moments to the team and to share their story to whatever degree they felt comfortable. Now, when we did this component, this was pre-pandemic, so this was a face-to-face exercise that we did. Now, why did we do this? I think as Erin mentioned, practicing vulnerability in conversation is a core part of anti-racist work. And at the same time, being vulnerable is one of the most difficult things to do in the work environment. So the goal with this exercise was to start getting us familiar with being vulnerable together and to encourage empathy in the workplace. Some people were more comfortable with sharing than others, but letting them know at the beginning of the exercise that we'd like them to share gave them an opportunity to prepare. And that was the definite overall takeaway, was that the importance of sending discussion prompts or information before the activity or scheduled meeting so that there's time for individuals to have that mental and emotional preparation. Another activity that we've used is a partner activity where we asked pairs to share a time that they had experienced difference. And we kept this as a partner activity on purpose, and we didn't have any larger share outs. And this question again requires vulnerability and empathy, and it requires both in that listening pair to have an empathetic listening ear. So why did we do this activity? Many times I've heard those on the USU campus say that we are lacking diversity. And we are a predominantly white institution, USU, but it's important to recognize that diversity is not always visible. And that was what this exercise was trying to get at. And what we learned is that people actually wanted more time to talk in their pairs. And it actually felt a little bit rushed when we did it in person. So that was another key takeaway, is to always plan more time than you think you might need for these discussions and activities. So a third activity, this is one that we're actually going to have some time to practice in real time here. And this was an activity that was getting us focused on getting out of our assumptions about our work and our patrons. And so I'm going to say 2 words, and we're going to put them on the board or on the screen here. And I want you to capture in your mind the first image that pops in your head. And if you're comfortable, Jessica will also put up a Mentimeter option where you can share using the code too, and we'll put that out in the box. So the image that I'd like you to consider is library patron. So what image first pops into your head? So it's menti.com, and you can use the code 37546. That's menti.com and code 37546. We have soccer mom, student, me. That's true, we often see ourselves in those that show. Mom or family with kids. Children, another mom. A female student around 20, a woman with books. Middle-aged woman wanting help looking for articles. Library regulars that come in to read the newspaper. Busy kids with a parent. A white woman, a family looking for various resources. Generic, housing insecure folks. A grandfather. Elderly couples. College freshman boy procrastinator. Teens looking to hang out. Yeah, thank you all for sharing. When I first did this exercise, we used the term USU student instead of library patron. When we did this with our unit, we used the term USU student. And when I first practiced, what I conjured in my head was an able-bodied, white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed freshman walking up to our info desk from our orientation. And I remember feeling very taken aback at the immediacy of this image. But I think the power of this exercise is it got me thinking about the implicit bias that I hold, and to remember the whole population that I serve as a librarian. And so this was, the purpose here was to get us thinking about the assumptions we often make about our patrons and who is not included. And it was a very short prompt, but it sure did pack a powerful punch. And we had one of the most meaningful unit discussions just with this short prompt and getting us thinking about our biases and our assumptions. So thank you all for sharing there too. A lot of the activities I've shared have focused on personal experiences and understandings, and throughout we made a point to try to facilitate reflection and discussion times where as a unit we would take a step back and try and identify how these personal reflections and discussions have helped us learn something new or think differently about our unit as a whole. So for us, we felt it really helped to come back and contextualize our conversations in that work environment and space. So asking that question, what did we learn as coworkers about our LES community and hearing and learning from each other? And lastly, one of the things, I know we hear a lot about meditation, but I can't tell you how meaningful I think this really was in terms of incorporating moments of pause and meditation in all of our discussions throughout that we've had in the past year. So EDI conversations are very much emotional work, and meditation can be a powerful tool to incorporate. And we've used the Calm app. I'm a huge lover of the loving kindness meditation and the 3-minute loving kindness meditation. We've also done strategies where we just ask attendees to mute or or in silence their screens, or and then take anywhere between 5 or 10 deep breaths to create moments to decompress throughout these conversations. And I think it can also really help for folks when you're in these conversations, perhaps with opposing views, to be able to take that pause and be able to truly listen and reflect before maybe we share out. So these are just a few examples of some of the discussion prompts and activities that we've used to facilitate these conversations in our unit. And we have shared a lot of content with you. So before we dive into the next part, I wanted to ask all of y'all to join me in a moment of silence here and take a moment of pause and take 3 deep breaths. So you're welcome to close your eyes. I like to sit back and close my eyes and get comfortable, and I'll count them off, and we can just kind of have a moment to get settled here. Okay, so one deep breath. 2. And 3. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed sharing these with you, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Katie now.
All right. So as we engaged in these discussions that Dory outlined with our colleagues, one of our earlier goals was to create EDI best practices that we could implement in our library, particularly in our information literacy instruction with our USU students. So we wanted to share with you all our process for creating those practices and what we ultimately came up with. So there were 4 key steps in the creation of our EDI best practices. First off, we learned from others. So many other libraries and institutions have already done a lot of work developing and sharing EDI practices. So we sought out first to learn from those who had already done work in this area, rather than just completely starting from scratch. Institutions and websites that we found helpful will be listed at the end of the PowerPoint on our resources slide. So next, we sought out the brain power and individual experiences of those in our library department. As Erin mentioned earlier, our work is really centered around instruction. So our EDI workshop last year, we worked in groups to brainstorm best practices that we could use to make our instruction more inclusive during our online and face-to-face library instruction sessions. We also invited a colleague from another department on campus to share her expertise, give us an outside perspective, and get us started in those conversations. Next, we realized that coming up with practices like this really requires time and it requires reflection. So we left up our large posters with all of our best practices that we brainstormed. We left them up around the office for a couple weeks and just allowed everyone time to reflect and think about those practices in our workshop and add to them over the next couple weeks. And finally, we synthesized. So we brought together all of those best practices, and we realized that it was going to be much more beneficial for us and for our colleagues if we developed broad and foundational principles that would encompass those more specific practices. So the graphic on this slide right here represents our EDI principles that we created and shared with our department. So our 3 major areas of our principles are be welcoming, be open, and be caring. So under be welcoming, we had model vulnerability. Our classes ask our students to have discussions, to participate a lot. And so we want to make sure we're modeling that same level of vulnerability that we're expecting from our students. We establish expectations, make sure there's no surprises. Everyone knows what's going to happen, what's expected of them. And we amplify student voices. So look for opportunities for students to share their own experiences and opinions. And then we have be open. So question assumptions. I think this really goes back to Christina's presentation that she did earlier today when she talked about implicit biases and questioning our own assumptions that we're making. And then use EDI related examples. We use these in like the scenarios and demonstrations that we do. And embrace EDI teaching moments. Oftentimes you can't plan for EDI teaching moments, and you kind of have to just lean into them and use them as a learning opportunity for you and your students. And then we have Be Caring. So under Be Caring, we have incorporate student reflection, take time to hear back from your students, engage in personal reflection, and to keep learning. So EDI isn't just a box you can check. It's continuous learning, continuously engaging in these discussions and learning about these issues. So while we are very proud of our EDI principles, we recognize that our library is different than a lot of your libraries and that you all have your own practices, environments, and opportunities for EDI work. So we would really like to use the next 10 minutes to brainstorm best practices in your own work within our Zoom breakout rooms. But before we break apart, we want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what inclusion means. So can I have you all once again add in the chat, what does inclusion mean to you? Our questions that we're going to have you guys to discuss are really centered around inclusion. So this will just make sure we're kind of all on the same page. No judgment anywhere, leveling the playing field so everyone can participate no matter their ability level. Inclusion means everyone feels safe in an environment. Creating spaces where all voices can be heard. Belonging. Okay, so keep these in mind. Everyone has a place at the table. So keep these in mind as you're having your discussions, and also what appeared in the chat earlier when Jessica had the discussion about equity, diversity, and inclusion. So in your breakout rooms, we have 3 questions that we want you to discuss. What are ways you can create an inclusive library environment? What are ways you can create inclusive activities and opportunities in your library? And what are ways you can implement inclusive content? I believe, yep, Erin already put these questions into chat, so we'll all have access to them once we go to our breakout rooms. When you're sharing in your groups, I really encourage you all to be vulnerable. Don't feel like you have to be an EDI expert to talk and share about your experiences. This is really an opportunity for open discussion and a place to ask questions and brainstorm together. Oh, I think we've got everybody back now. So I had some really great conversations in my session. I hope you all felt the same. We don't have time for everyone to share everything that they discussed, but feel free to add anything to the chat that you think would benefit the larger group to hear about.
Okay, so to wrap everything up, now that we've discussed what equity, diversity, and inclusion are, how we started some conversations about EDI with our coworkers, and how we developed these EDI best practices, we wanted you to reflect on what we've discussed. So for the next couple of minutes, come up with a goal or something that you could do in the near future to practice EDI principles. Then you can draft an email to yourself that will be sent to you at a later date. So I'm going to play a song for a couple minutes, and once the song is over, we'll open up for questions. All right, thank you everyone for taking that time to reflect. We really appreciate it. We're now open to answer questions that you may have. I'm gonna quickly show you these references. So everything, we have references for things we refer to for our EDI conversations and our best practices, and these will be included when you get the slides for this. So we're now open for questions, so feel free to ask us any questions that you may have.
I'm just really impressed that you guys took on leading these groups yourselves. I feel like at my library, if we were to do something like this, we would invite somebody from outside the library to come in and do a workshop and kind of get things going. So it's just giving me a lot to think about.
Thank you. Ooh, can I show that last slide? Yes, I'll show that last slide with all the resources.
I just want to say, Emily, I think that's a great point too. And I think one of the things where we were able to do that is because we were focusing within the unit perspective. And I think as we're starting to have these conversations more library wide, that's where I'm seeing people talking more about needing to bring people into. So I think there's some leverage in having some of these conversations too in your smaller groups.
Mm-hmm.
Erin or Katie, do one of y'all want to take the, what do you think was the biggest learning point for this experience?
I think one of my biggest learning, I always felt so like inadequate or not well versed in EDI issues. And I think my biggest learning point was like, so many people are right there with me and no one's going to judge me as I'm learning about these issues and how to do a better job with them. So I think that just like diving into these conversations, that really, really was the big learning point for me, that like, it's okay no matter where I'm at starting in these conversations. The point is that I'm joining the conversation.
Thank you, Katie. I think that's great. Yeah, just what she said. And also, I don't know if you remember an earlier point that Dory had raised, that, you know, our goal initially was really focused more so on instruction. But in order to get there, we really had to build community. You know, we had to have these conversations with each other. And so, and I think just to kind of, you know, marry those 2 points, it was a lot of us were, you know, kind of maybe a little bit timid to even start to have, have these conversations, especially in the workplace when it is really, it can be challenging to be vulnerable. But I think in order to get there in terms of like a lot of these best practices and later on having trainings on microaggressions and things like that, we had to first start with that community piece. And also, Emily, I think you raised a really good point, and we did bring in, I'm not sure if Katie mentioned it before, but we did bring in one of our English 2010 instructors for the teaching part of it. And it was really nice to have, she was there to really kind of help to drive a lot of those conversations.
Nice.
I'll just throw in, I think one thing to Jamie, your question about if there was something that routinely come up that was difficult for people to grapple with. I think when we had first kind of our first discussion, we just kind of had people and we facilitated it. But what we really found is that people wanted preparation beforehand so that they knew what we were going to talk about, the format, the process. And so I think it was maybe just difficult in the sense that people didn't feel prepared. But that's one thing I feel like we've been really, people in our unit have been really engaged in the conversations. Other folks' ideas on that?
I think you really hit it, Dory. I think people really like that reflection time. They actually wanted pre-work. It was funny that after we had that the fall workshop, or, you know, we had like a half-day workshop, we surveyed everyone. I mean, we have a fairly small unit, but our unit's 13 people. Everyone said, we want more. We want pre-work. We don't just want this once a semester. You know, we want it. So we did a training then maybe 2 months later. We were thinking we were going to shoot for a half an hour. They really wanted pre-work. They wanted to have reflection time. We did something after that as well. And so, and then, you know, even further, we ended up starting a reading group. I think the only thing with that has just been a little bit of maybe power dynamics. So that's probably the only point that we've grappled with, just in terms of how do we partner people in reading groups, especially if it's on anti-racist areas.
I was wondering about reading groups. Did you do like a full-length book or did you do articles?
Let's see, we've done a movie and a documentary and a book so far. Is that right, Dory and Katie?
Yeah, and there's also been, we created an EDI channel. Now I can't remember the full name, but in Slack. And it's just something where there are a few folks outside of our unit, but it's predominantly our unit folks that are interested in it, and people just throw in readings and ideas that way too. So a lot of it's started to happen a little bit more, or free form, for lack of a better word, instead of like really structured stuff as well.
Yeah. So reading group seems like could be really nice. I just wasn't sure if people would want to read a full-length book, but a documentary sounds fun too.
Yes, yeah, that was really good. I'm trying to think which one it was. Oh, Just Mercy.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
I can go ahead and answer this question if y'all want. So the question is, did you run into any strong resistance against these discussions taking place? I felt like we were really lucky because we really didn't have any strong resistance. But part of that is because our unit works very collaboratively and closely together. There were some questions, like, I guess one of the biggest resistances that we did come up with is it is hard for people to be vulnerable. But as we did these different activities and stuff together, and we were all vulnerable together, it helped us want to have these discussions more. Because I think one of the hardest things that people have when having these discussions is they don't want to mess up and they don't want to do something wrong. But when we recognized as a group that it was okay and that we could accept our mistakes and then move on from them, then that allowed those discussions to continue to take place. So our workshop was a good experience, which is why we continue to have those discussions as a unit. Do any of you have anything else you want to add to that?
I would just say one thing I think that kind of helps with those, like getting people to be more vulnerable, is thinking about how you're asking them to share. So like we used Mentimeter, and we used that in our workshop with our colleagues, giving them a chance to share anonymously when we thought that would make them more comfortable. And then we also, like Dory mentioned, some things we did just partners and we didn't ask them to share out to the larger group, or sometimes it was just a time for self-reflection and then you weren't asked to share that further. So thinking about like what you're asking them to share and why it's necessary for them to share it with a larger group, I think is good, rather than just seeking vulnerability for just vulnerability and sharing's sake. Thinking about why you're asking it and if there might be other ways to do it.
I think we're starting to run into some of these harder conversations as the library is having its our library-wide task force in terms of the different expectations from different units and balancing those out. And so I imagine some of those figuring out how to balance those different values and approaches will come into play at probably a little bit more. Resistance is, yeah, I said values instead of resistance, but I think it's something that we're still working with.
Here's an interesting anecdote too. We have, probably like many of your places of work, we have like an equity and diversity office at USU, and they've done a number of trainings. And one of them was on what they call Upstanding, which is like a bystander intervention program so for just, generally preventing any kind of problematic situations. And the content, I think, of the training was a little bit, it was just problematic for a number of reasons. And so that's been probably the only point that I can really think about in terms of strong resistance. Not really resistance, but what was interesting was that afterwards we started hearing from a number of different people that they really just wanted to talk about, just kind of debrief about some of the things that they found a little bit unsettling in the training. And so we just made this an optional discussion, and everyone from our unit attended. So I think that, that shows you, like, we did, we really did try to have, like university-wide trainings that were coming in, but in the end, I mean, it can be tough because not every, you know, I think it's, it was just a convoluted thing that happened to happen with this particular training.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of people think like, oh, is the library stuff, is it just going to be another thing that the university is doing? And so that's one thing we're trying to think about how to make sure it's personalized and contextualized.
Exactly. Well, if anyone thinks of any other questions, please feel free to reach out. You have all of our contact info. We'd be happy to share any materials that we can with you. Thank you for your time today.